I thought I was just visiting an old friend of the family. But that quiet night, something shifted between us. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it changed the way I saw him forever. And in the silence, I realized I wasn't alone in what I felt. The rain had just stopped when Eli stepped out of the car, his sneakers crunching softly against the damp gravel of the driveway. The countryside air smelled of wet leaves, pine, and faint wood smoke from a nearby chimney. Before him stood the quiet house he hadn't visited in years, still tucked between tall trees like it had been frozen in time. It looked smaller than he remembered, though maybe it was Eli who had grown, changed, become someone else entirely. He pulled the strap of his backpack over one shoulder and took a breath before approaching the front door. There was a soft glow in the window, a promise of warmth inside, but something about it made his chest tighten. It wasn't fear exactly. It was anticipation, the kind that built up when you returned to a place where things had once mattered deeply. Oliver opened the door before Eli could knock. He looked the same, maybe a little more gray in the beard, a little more tired around the eyes, but the same quiet presence. No big greetings, no dramatic embraces. Just a nod, a hint of a smile, and a step back to let him in. The house smelled of cedarwood and something baking, though the kitchen was empty. Shoes were lined up neatly by the door, books stacked on every available surface, blueprints rolled and tucked into shelves like sleeping animals. The quiet was comforting. No television, no background music, just the muffled drip of water from the eaves and the faint creak of floorboards underfoot. Eli dropped his bag by the couch and looked around. It was strange how some places held memory like scent, things that lingered even after the people were gone. He could still see shadows of his younger self curled up in the armchair, tracing the lines of a drawing Oliver had once made, listening to the scratch of pencil against paper in the next room. Oliver offered him a drink, tea, as always, and disappeared into the kitchen. Eli wandered slowly through the living room, running his fingers across the edge of a wooden table worn smooth with time. Everything here felt solid, built to last, just like the man who owned it. When they sat down at tea, there wasn't much conversation, just the sound of spoons tapping porcelain and the occasional glance across the table. The silence didn't press between them. It settled gently, like a shared blanket. Neither of them had ever been much for words. That had been true even when Eli was a teenager, visiting during long weekends while his mother worked double shifts. Oliver had stepped in then, not as a father figure, not even quite a mentor, but something steadier, a fixed point when everything else shifted. Now, years later, Eli watched the way Oliver stirred his tea absent-mindedly, the way his eyes flicked toward the window like they were still chasing some thought too big for words. Eli felt something stir inside him, a kind of curiosity that wasn't entirely new but had grown sharper with time. Maybe it was admiration. Maybe it was something he hadn't allowed himself to name yet. They spent the rest of the evening fixing a cabinet door that didn't really need fixing. Oliver held the screws steady while Eli adjusted the hinges. Their hands worked in quiet rhythm, passing tools back and forth, brushing occasionally. Each touch was casual, but not entirely unnoticed. Later, they shared a simple meal, vegetable stew and bread that Eli helped slice. They ate by the window, the candlelight flickering over the grain of the table. Outside, the trees shifted gently in the wind. The moment felt oddly cinematic, like something Eli would want to remember in detail, even though nothing dramatic was happening. It was in the stillness, the small gestures, that the night built its meaning. When it grew late, Oliver offered him the guest bed upstairs, but Eli shook his head, opting instead for the couch. It was the same one he'd slept on as a teenager, and somehow he wanted to relive the simplicity of those nights. He changed into sweatpants and a worn t-shirt, folded the blanket over his legs, and leaned into the familiar discomfort of the cushions. The fireplace had gone out, but its warmth lingered faintly in the air. Oliver stood by the stairwell for a moment longer than necessary, watching him. His expression was unreadable, caught between habit and hesitation. Then, with a quiet goodnight, he climbed the stairs, leaving Eli alone in the stillness. The house settled into silence. Eli lay still, listening to the familiar creaks and groans of wood expanding in the night air. His eyes traced the ceiling, then the empty space where shadows played softly against the far wall. The blanket smelled like fabric softener and pine. It wrapped around him in a way that made him feel protected and oddly exposed at the same time. He wasn't sure why his heart beat a little faster now than it had before. Maybe it was the stillness. Or maybe it was the realization that this house, this quiet man upstairs, still held a part of him he hadn't acknowledged in years. Something had brought him back here. Something more than convenience or nostalgia. As the night deepened, so did the silence. And in that silence, Eli felt the first stirrings of something unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Morning light filtered through the half-closed curtains, casting long strips of gold across the floor. Eli stirred slowly, reluctant to leave the cocoon of warmth the blanket had built through the night. The house was already awake in a quiet, deliberate way. Somewhere in the kitchen, he could hear the low hum of the kettle and the faint clink of a mug being set down. It was the kind of morning that asked nothing of him. No rush, no noise, just the promise of another slow, uneventful day. He sat up, stretching his arms over his head before padding barefoot toward the smell of coffee. The hardwood floor was cool beneath his feet. In the kitchen, Oliver moved with the ease of routine, pouring 2 cups, one of which he slid across the table without a word. Eli accepted it silently, grateful for the warmth in his hands more than the caffeine. They drank together in quiet harmony, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. It was a rhythm Eli remembered well. This ability they had to share space without demanding anything from it. No need for questions or updates. Just being. After breakfast, Oliver suggested they tackle a few small repairs around the house. Not because anything truly needed fixing, but because it gave the hands something to do and the mind somewhere to rest. They spent the late morning sorting through a collection of old tools in the garage, each item carefully examined and placed into its rightful drawer. Eli found himself drawn into the simplicity of it. Metal against wood, the clean scent of oil and dust, the satisfying click of a drawer closing perfectly. There was something grounding about the way Oliver worked. Every motion was purposeful, patient. Eli had always admired that about him, even when he was too young to understand why. Now, watching him tighten screws with steady hands and wipe down surfaces with care, Eli felt a quiet sense of reverence. The man before him was not extraordinary in the way people often imagine greatness, but there was a solidity to him, a kind of gentle strength that asked for nothing but offered everything. In the afternoon, they moved outside to the small garden behind the house. Fallen leaves blanketed the stone path, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. Eli raked slowly, not out of necessity, but to linger in the moment. Occasionally, their arms would brush as they crossed paths, and each time Eli felt something stir beneath his calm exterior, an awareness that hummed just beneath the skin. Later, they sat on the back porch, cups of hot tea warming their palms as they watched the sun dip lower. The sky turned from soft blue to deep amber, and the trees cast long shadows across the lawn. Eli pulled his knees up to his chest, resting his chin there, and let the silence settle again between them. In that quiet, his mind drifted. He thought of how different life felt here compared to the city, how the hours moved slower, how the silence wasn't empty but full of presence. He watched Oliver from the corner of his eye, noting the way his eyes followed the wind through the trees, the way his jaw tightened when he thought no one was looking. There was a stillness in him, but it wasn't cold. It was rooted, unshakable. The evening came gently. They made a simple dinner, roasted vegetables, rice, and a bit of lemon. Eli helped with the chopping, occasionally pausing to sneak a piece of carrot, and each time he did, Oliver would glance at him with the faintest trace of amusement. It wasn't teasing exactly. It was a kind of warmth, like the look someone gives you when they've known you for a long time and are still quietly glad you're there. Afterward, they cleaned the kitchen side by side. Dishes clinked softly, water ran, towels dried hands in shared rhythm. Eli found comfort in these mundane acts. In a way, their movements mirrored each other. It felt like dancing without music, like telling a story without needing to speak. As night settled in, Eli returned to the couch while Oliver gathered the firewood. The fire cracked to life with a few practice motions, and soon the room filled with a soft orange glow. They didn't speak much, and they didn't need to. The warmth of the flames, the quiet companionship, the small sips of tea, they said enough. Eli curled under the same blanket as the night before, letting his body sink deeper into the couch. Oliver settled into the armchair beside him, a book resting loosely in his hands, though he didn't seem to be reading. Instead, he gazed into the fire, his eyes reflecting the flicker of flames, his thoughts far away. Eli watched him for a while, hidden beneath the edge of the blanket. There was something different about this time together, an energy that hadn't existed years ago. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was something warmer, heavier, like possibility. And though nothing had been said, nothing had changed in any obvious way, Eli felt it. The quiet pull of gravity between them. The beginning of something unspoken. The wind picked up after midnight, brushing against the windows in soft waves. It wasn't loud enough to disturb most people, but for Eli, who had never truly adjusted to silence, the sound threaded itself through his light sleep like a whispered thought. The fire had long since gone out, leaving behind only faint warmth in the living room air. Shadows danced lazily on the ceiling, cast by the muted light of a hallway nightlight left on upstairs. Eli shifted beneath the blanket, eyes half closed, unsure whether he was fully awake or simply drifting through a fragile state between dreams. The quiet of the house wasn't empty. It carried a kind of weight. Every creak of the walls, every subtle shift in the air felt deliberate, like the house was breathing around him. Then came a sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, slow. Eli didn't move. He knew the rhythm, had heard it before during past visits. Oliver had always been someone who checked the house before sleeping. Doors, windows, the stove, the locks. A routine born not of paranoia, but of control, of steadiness. Eli had often wondered if it helped Oliver sleep better, knowing that everything was as it should be. But this time the steps stopped nearby. Too close. He opened his eyes, just a sliver, and let them adjust to the dim light. Oliver stood at the edge of the room, barely a silhouette. His presence was calm, unmoving, like a figure cut out of the shadows. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Not out of fear, but something else, something more fragile, more aware. Eli didn't speak. Instead, he observed. The way Oliver's posture wasn't tense, but wasn't relaxed either. The way his head tilted ever so slightly, as if he was watching Eli sleep or debating whether to leave him undisturbed. It was an oddly intimate moment, too quiet to be explained. Eventually, Oliver stepped closer and sank into the armchair by the fireplace. He didn't turn on a light. He didn't move with purpose. He just sat, his hands resting on his knees, his face lit faintly by the glow from the hallway. Eli closed his eyes again, unsure what to do with the moment. He wasn't afraid. Quite the opposite. There was something comforting in knowing he wasn't alone, even if nothing was being said. It was like the quiet between them had taken on a shape of its own, something solid and soft at once. The minutes passed slowly. From where he lay, Eli could hear the subtle shifts in Oliver's breathing. Not quite deep enough to be sleep, not fast enough to be wakefulness. Somewhere in between. Eli wondered what was on his mind, whether he'd been thinking about the past or about why this visit felt different from the others. He thought of the years between them, the quiet space that had once been filled with guidance and distance, and now seemed to be filling with something else. Something harder to name. As the wind pressed again against the windows, Eli rolled gently to his side, facing the fireplace and, by extension, the chair beside it. He didn't open his eyes, but he allowed himself to be aware of the warmth still lingering in the air, of the sound of breath in a room that was no longer empty, of the strange comfort he felt from Oliver's presence. He remembered other nights like this, long ago, nights where he couldn't sleep and would wander into the kitchen, only to find Oliver already there, sipping something warm and looking out at the trees. They'd sit together sometimes, neither of them speaking, both content with silence. Back then, Eli had thought those moments were ordinary. Now, he saw them differently. They were the foundation of something steady, something unspoken but enduring. Eventually, Oliver stood again, his movement careful. The chair creaked softly as he shifted his weight, and Eli felt a small flutter of disappointment rise in his chest. But then the footsteps didn't lead upstairs. They came closer. The edge of the couch dipped slightly as Oliver sat. Not all the way, just enough to rest on the cushion. Eli remained still, unsure if the moment called for movement or stillness. The air felt charged, like the pause before thunder. No words were spoken, but the silence was full. Eli could feel the warmth radiating from Oliver's presence. He didn't need to open his eyes to know that the distance between them had shrunk, not just physically, but in other ways too. Something had shifted, something essential. There were no confessions, no dramatic revelations, just breath and presence, and the unshakable awareness that something had begun to form quietly between them, woven from years of mutual respect, quiet comfort, and something newer, something tender and tentative. The couch felt smaller than before. Or maybe it was just that the space between them felt heavier, fuller, like it meant something now. Eli didn't move. He let the moment settle, stretch, deepen. Somewhere inside him, a question began to take shape. Not a loud question, but one that hummed beneath his skin. Whatever it was, he didn't need the answer just yet. He just let it be. The night deepened into stillness. Outside, the trees stood frozen in the quiet, their bare branches painted silver by the moonlight. Inside, the house had gone completely silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional shift of wood contracting in the walls. Eli lay on the couch, half curled under the blanket, his thoughts too alive for rest. Beside him, the cushion still carried the faint imprint of Oliver's weight. Though the man had risen moments ago and returned to the armchair, the presence he left behind lingered, like warmth after the fire has gone out. Eli hadn't moved. He couldn't, not from hesitation, but from something more uncertain, something that had settled deep in his chest like a knot. There was a current moving between them now, invisible but undeniable. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it was there in the way their eyes had met across the room earlier, in the closeness of Oliver's body on the edge of the couch, in the silence that had grown thicker but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that asked questions without ever demanding answers. Eli's thoughts spun in quiet loops. The years they'd known each other, the space that had once been filled with distance and now hummed with closeness, the way his breath had caught when their knees had brushed earlier in the garden. Nothing had happened, not really, but something had changed. He could feel it in the way the air between them had begun to stretch, like a held breath waiting to be released. Oliver sat quietly in the chair again, facing the fireless hearth, his features lit only by the faint glow from the hallway. He wasn't reading, wasn't fidgeting. He simply existed in the space, still and steady, like he always had. But even in his stillness, Eli sensed a shift, a tension in the shoulders, a hesitation in the posture. Without thinking, Eli turned to face him fully. The movement was slow, quiet, but intentional. The blanket slipped slightly off his shoulder as he adjusted, and he didn't bother pulling it back up. The air wasn't cold anymore. Not really. Minutes passed. No one moved. It was as though both of them were waiting for something neither had the words to name. And then, without a sound, Oliver stood. He didn't go upstairs. He didn't return to the kitchen. Instead, he stepped forward, each footfall deliberate but unhurried. When he reached the couch, he paused, looking down at Eli. His expression wasn't entirely readable, not guarded but not open either. There was something careful in it, like he was trying not to disturb the balance of a moment that had taken all night to form. He lowered himself to sit again on the edge of the couch, this time closer. Eli didn't flinch. He felt his body respond instinctively, not with fear, but with awareness. Every part of him became attuned to the space they shared, to the way the room seemed to quiet further in response to the shift. The silence between them deepened. Not awkward, not tense, just full. Eli let his gaze fall to the floor for a moment, then lifted it again toward Oliver. Their eyes met, briefly, then again with more intention. There was something vulnerable in that glance, something tentative. Eli had never been good at naming emotions, especially his own, but he recognized the feeling now. Recognition. Of something he had felt before, but had never allowed to take shape. His hand, half hidden beneath the folds of the blanket, rested loosely on the cushion between them. And then, barely noticeable, the couch shifted. Oliver's hand brushed against his. Not a grasp, not a reach, just the faintest contact, as if testing the air between them. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a ripple through Eli that echoed far beyond the surface of skin. He didn't pull away. He didn't even breathe for a moment. The fingers lingered, still not gripping, still not moving with intent, just resting there beside his. Quiet, present, real. Eli's heart began to thrum louder in his ears, not from fear, but from a strange mixture of anticipation and calm. This wasn't a moment of impulse. It wasn't rushed or careless. It was steady, careful, like every shared silence, every unspoken memory had been leading here. He let his fingers shift ever so slightly, not to grab, not to signal, but to allow. It was a gesture of permission, quiet and tentative. Their hands didn't fully meet, but now they rested against one another, palm to palm, unmoving. Outside, the wind had stopped. Inside, the only sound was the slow rhythm of two people breathing. Eli didn't know what this meant. He didn't know what would come next. But in that moment, nothing felt forced or unnatural. The touch was simple, gentle, full of a weight that words would only complicate. The moment didn't need language. It had already spoken for itself. The house was silent, but not in the way it had been earlier. Now the silence carried weight, not the kind that pressed down, but the kind that held something delicate in its hands. The night had grown long, and Eli had no idea how much time had passed since their hands had found each other in the quiet. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter. He lay still on the couch, wrapped in the soft warmth of the blanket, his hand resting gently beside Oliver's. They were holding hands, not really, but they weren't apart either. Their fingers had found an invisible understanding, a contact that didn't need to be declared, only acknowledged. Eli's eyes had adjusted fully to the low light. He could see Oliver's profile clearly now, softened by the dimness. His expression was unreadable but calm, as if something inside him had finally settled. He didn't look away, didn't shift his weight, didn't move to break the stillness between them. That told Eli more than words could. He tried to recall the last time he had felt this close to someone. Not physically, emotionally. When had he last allowed another person to linger so near without retreating into himself? When had he last welcomed vulnerability like this, with no need to defend or explain? There were questions he could have asked, about what this meant, about what might happen next, about whether any of this was okay or wise or sustainable. But none of those questions would have changed what had already happened between them. The closeness that had been forming over time, in silence, in glances, in the simplicity of ordinary routines. Eli turned slightly, his body curling in toward Oliver's in a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. But it didn't. He felt the shift in the air, the faint response, a tension that rose, then fell. Oliver didn't move away. He stayed. A long breath escaped Eli's chest. Not a sigh, just release. The air felt thick with meaning, but not with pressure. No one was asking anything of the other. They were just here, together, in the quiet aftermath of something unnamed but real. Outside, the sky began to pale. Dawn was still distant, but the edges of night had started to soften. The darkness wasn't as deep anymore. Somewhere, birds would begin to stir soon, and the house would return to its daytime rhythm. But for now, the world remained paused, just for them. Oliver shifted at last, not away but forward. He leaned back slightly, resting more comfortably into the couch, his posture less guarded. Eli felt the change immediately, not just in the physical space, but in the emotional current that passed between them. Whatever tension had existed earlier had transformed into something warmer. It didn't feel forbidden or frightening. It felt honest. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the closeness settle around him like the blanket on his skin. The rise and fall of Oliver's breathing beside him became a kind of rhythm, grounding and familiar. It wasn't loud or demanding. It was steady. It was there. Eli didn't need a label for what had passed between them tonight. He didn't need to define it, didn't need to categorize it. What mattered was the feeling, that slow, careful discovery of closeness in the most unexpected of places. The intimacy of presence. The quiet decision not to run. He remembered childhood moments, nights when storms had frightened him and he'd sought comfort without words. This moment was nothing like those in situation, but the sensation was oddly similar, being near someone who understood what silence could hold, someone who didn't demand explanations or performances. Eventually, their hands drifted apart, not because of discomfort, but because the gesture had served its purpose. The connection remained, even without touch. It pulsed in the quiet space between them, in the soft light that now began to filter in through the curtains. Oliver rose, finally, stretching gently before heading toward the kitchen. The floor creaked under his weight, and the sound felt almost reassuring. Eli stayed where he was, listening to the kettle being filled, the hum of early morning starting to take shape. Life, ordinary and unchanged, continued. And yet, something had changed. When Oliver returned, he brought a mug of tea and placed it on the table without a word. Eli sat up slowly, wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, and accepted it with a quiet nod. Their eyes met, just for a moment, and though neither of them smiled, there was something exchanged in that glance, something soft and unspoken. The day would go on. There would be errands to run, things to clean, meals to cook. But Eli knew that the night they had just shared would live in the quiet space between them for a long time. Not as a secret, not as a moment to analyze or fear, but as the start of something honest. Something not rushed. Something real.